Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be and whatever time it is during the day. My name is Steve Nightingale, and I'll be running a project this year which is entitled Optimising Electricity Generation and Distribution in the UK. So to start with, I'm going to give you the problem and the motivation for the project. During 1.5 hour period on June the 6th this year, Ocean Winds wind farm in the Moray Firth was paid $72,000 not to generate electricity. And at the same time, the Grain gas-fired power station in the Thames estuary was paid $43,000 to provide more electricity. Last year, over the whole of the year, Seagreen, which is Scotland's largest wind farm, was paid $65 million to restrict its output 71% of the time. And this issue of balancing the grid in the first half of 2025 has already cost 500 million and is projected to cost 800 million by the end of the year. And the cost to each member of the population will be around £15 per head. That's £60 per head for a typical family, and rising to about £112 per head in 2030, with no adjustment for inflation. In addition, we had a government statement from the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, where he said his ambition is to ensure that 95% of the country's electricity will come from low carbon sources by 2030, which he promised will slash the average electricity bill by £300. And this is extremely ambitious in the light of what I've just said. So the project is to investigate the reasons for these payments being made for decreasing and or increasing electricity generation. And as I said, it's primarily because we have electricity generation systems, whether it's a wind farm, a solar energy farm, an oil-fired or gas-fired power station, or whatever it is, and they're not necessarily located where there is a high electricity requirement. So if you want to transport it to where the requirement is, you need to do it via the grid, except the problem with the grid is it was designed many years ago and it can't handle the sort of power levels that we currently have available. So what you have to do is to shut down or reduce the output from one particular place, such as a wind farm, as I've just described, and in another place get them to ramp it up. So to propose what changes and improvements could be made to the electricity generation and distribution system to minimise these payments, you need to estimate the implementation costs, the benefits and the timescales of your proposed approaches. You should evaluate and comment on the UK government's Road to Zero strategy and whether this should be revised. Now, the Road to Zero strategy was brought out some years ago and it's been revised each year, usually downgraded. And the plan originally was that by 2050, we'd be net zero in terms of our carbon footprint and carbon generation. And when you think that Ed Miliband is thinking that we're going to generate 95% of our electricity in 5 years' time by renewable sources, I think that's extremely ambitious, because what that means is no coal, which is already pretty low, no oil and no gas-fired power stations. So you need to comment on that, on his statement, and also the current Road to Zero strategy. So there'll be two groups working on these projects, and one will be looking at Northern England and Scotland, and the other will be looking at Southern England, where there'll be a dividing line around the borders between Leicestershire and Derbyshire. So if we look at some figures as to what's generated by what particular fuel, currently about 40% of electricity comes from natural gas, around 40% comes from renewable energies, with wind and solar being the main contributors. Nuclear is currently around 15%. Coal is between 2 and 3% and decreasing all the time. Biomass, which basically means wood, twigs, branches, that kind of thing, around 5%, and hydro actually less than 1%. And the important thing to note with these figures, and when you investigate other figures, is if you take something like a gas-fired power station, it's basically running all the time, but what it provides might go up and down a bit to allow for peaks and troughs during the day. Whereas a wind farm, you can't really control that at all. You get a contribution from the wind whenever it's blowing. And although you have a cut in and a cut out speed, which gives you a fairly broad capability over which you can generate electricity, you have to put up with what's available and adjust things accordingly. Similarly, with a solar energy farm, and you've got an even greater problem there, in that you can't generate any electricity at night because there's no sun, whereas of course you can at least generate electricity from a wind farm, assuming the wind's blowing at night, which it is quite often. A relevant point to look at is a typical demand load, and so what I've shown here is what the demand load is over a typical day, with best case and worst case examples, if you like, winter and summer, where you can see that between the peaks and the troughs in the summer, it's about a 3-to-1 ratio. In the winter, it's less. You get the minimum requirement between about 2 and 6 o'clock in the morning, and then in the evening between sort of 6 and 8 o'clock is when you get the peak typically, which is more noticeable in the winter. Now, of course, renewable energies, you'll be familiar with these, I'm sure. So this is showing a wind farm on land. We have wind farms on land and in the sea. The main reason for putting them in the sea, like in the North Sea, is because you get a more constant wind velocity in the sea, but you have the disadvantage that the installation and maintenance costs are higher because you've got to install them on some kind of platform that's anchored to the seabed, and also the corrosion issues with salt spray and so on are something you don't generally have on a land-based wind farm. Solar energy farms, you'll see these around the country, and of course you'll see people have solar panels on their roof. They tend not to put windmills on because it doesn't make good sense from a contribution point of view, never mind the fact that you've got to have some structure to support a windmill of any decent size. And one of the things that will immediately come to mind here is that you could look at storing some of the energy from these renewable energy sources. Tesla have installed large storage systems, which are essentially chemical batteries, in a number of different countries as well as in the States. And this is based on their lithium-ion technology. It's a great technology, high energy density storage, operates at ambient temperature. The problem is it's quite expensive and it uses expensive metals. And really the reason for that, why one goes for a lithium-ion battery, is because of the safety. It runs at ambient temperature, and it has a very high, compared with other chemical batteries, a very high storage density. But there are other kinds of battery, and when you are stationary, like you might be if you're wanting to store energy from a wind farm, you could look at using some other kind of battery. Now, some of the alternatives are a sodium sulfur battery. This is a very well established energy storage system in many countries, particularly in China. The energy density is not as high as for lithium ion, but it does have the advantage it's very robust. So that's one energy storage system that you need to consider in your options. Another is a liquid metal battery energy storage system from a company like Ambri in the States. Now, if you look at chemical batteries, in particular things like lithium ion, one of the problems that limits their life is this dendritic growth you get on the electrodes that gradually grow through the the liquid electrolyte or paste electrolyte until you get some sort of shorting phenomenon occurring. And this reduces the life of the battery as well as its ability to store charge for any length of time. Now, if you go for a battery that uses liquid metal, you're constantly renewing the electrodes all the time, so you don't get any problem due to the number of charge-discharge cycles growing these dendrites and then decreasing the battery life. And so as a result of that, you can charge and discharge it as many times as you like without any negative effect. The disadvantage with this kind of battery is it's got a lower energy density for its storage, and it also runs at 350 to 400 degrees C. And neither of those are really a problem if you've got a stationary storage requirement. And in fact, Amberley have been installing in the Eastern Cape in South Africa an energy storage system that is probably complete about now. It was started, I think, in 2022. So there are a number of alternatives you have for energy storage using a chemical battery of one sort or another. Of course, you've got other techniques such as storing energy by pumping water uphill, but that's only good if you've got a convenient mountain nearby, which you tend not to have down in the south. Another thing that you can look at is using hydrogen storage. So you can consider this. You could have a chemical battery or a series of batteries, a battery bank on a wind farm, or what you could do is use the excess energy that's available from a wind farm. Rather than just not to generate as much, you generate as much as you can from the wind that's blowing, and use the excess that's not required by the consumers in the country generally. You use that to run an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen and oxygen, and then you store that, most probably in the case of hydrogen and oxygen, by storing it under pressure. There are a number of different methods, but let's say you store it under pressure, and then you can distribute that around the country for various requirements. But what it could also do is when more energy is required because the wind isn't blowing that much, you can use the hydrogen to run a fuel cell to generate electricity. So it's a slightly more complicated way of storing energy, but it's something that could be entertained. So that really gives you an idea of the background. It's really all looking at how one can minimise the problem we currently have of the fact that the supply and demand available from the various generation stations throughout the country doesn't actually meet the requirements. So on this project, it's a systems engineering project, and it will draw on many aspects of engineering that are common to all disciplines. You need to make sure that you know how to chair a meeting and take proper minutes. And I do have some notes on this, so I'll send them out before you start, once I know who's going to be in my particular team, or two teams, assuming I have two. And the important point here is I want to see proper minutes. So these are the minutes you would have to provide to, say, a company that you are working for to provide a report, a study, or the design of something. And they will use this as a formal document to say what you've achieved and what's also being agreed by them when you have your minutes with your meetings with them. So it's a very important thing, and it's not the same as what are sometimes called minutes or notes you might make within your own company when you have meetings between yourselves in the company. These are something that's going to be supplied to a customer, and they are a formal legal document. In terms of information sources, don't just rely on online resources. See what you have in the library, and also go and talk to people in Surrey University, because there's a lot of knowledge and capability there. And if you have certain ideas that you think might be appropriate, you can by all means raise them at our weekly meetings, but you can also go and talk to people in university who have got a lot of experience in these areas, and say, I was thinking about this and this, what do you think? And they might say, well, that sounds very good, but have you considered this and this? Because that's also part of the picture. So it's useful to bounce your thoughts and ideas off a more experienced person. Another point is make sure you keep abreast of what's actually going on by reading a decent newspaper. The Times and Telegraph give you a good idea of what's going on technologically. And also, your library should have, it certainly used to have, the house journals of various organisations like Ingenia, which is the magazine from the Royal Academy of Engineering, Spectrum, which is from the US organisation, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. There's the Engineering and Technology magazine from what was the IEE, now the IET, and Physics World, which is from the Institute of Physics. Now, they have published over the years a lot of articles related to energy storage, renewable energies, pros and cons, about the electricity grid and all the rest of it. And you can phone them up and ask, or say what you're doing, and ask if they can tell you when these things were published, or whether you can go online and check for particular types of publications you're interested in. So I think that's about all I was going to say at the moment, and I look forward to meeting you all when we have our first meeting. So thank you very much.